There is a specific kind of town in America that feels different the moment you drive into it. The main street sits a little too neat. The old brick buildings crowd close together like they were planned instead of grown, and somewhere nearby there is probably a bakery selling something called sugar cake, or a shop still hand-dipping beeswax candles, or a star-shaped lantern hanging from a porch in the middle of July for no obvious reason. If you have ever felt that quiet, deliberate order in a small town in Pennsylvania or North Carolina and wondered why it seemed so intentional, there is a good chance you were standing in a town founded by people who called themselves the Unitas Fratrum, known in English as the Moravian Church. They were refugees from a corner of Central Europe most Americans could not point to on a map, driven out of Moravia and Bohemia and later Saxony by 3 centuries of religious persecution. They built their American towns the way they had learned to build their faith, in tight formation, planned down to the lot line, meant to hold together no matter what came next. And when genealogists started tracing the family lines that came out of those settlements, they found something the ordinary story of American immigration rarely produces. A closed, intermarried religious community leaves a genetic signature behind, a short list of surnames that keeps resurfacing in the same handful of counties 250 years later, carried by people who have no idea where it came from. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Moravian story in America begins in 1741, in a patch of Pennsylvania forest along the Lehigh River, where a group of settlers named their new home Bethlehem after the town where their savior was born. They had been sent by Count Nikolaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf, a Saxon nobleman who had given shelter to persecuted Protestants from Moravia on his own estate at Herrnhut and then helped organize their missionary push across the Atlantic, once that estate could no longer hold everyone who kept arriving at his gates. Within a few years, the Pennsylvania Moravians had planted sister towns nearby, Nazareth and later Lititz, each one run on the same principle, a shared community treasury, communal workshops, a single brother's house and a single sister's house, standing at the center of town like the congregation's own dormitories, and a level of internal record-keeping that would make a modern accountant nervous. Every birth, every marriage, every death, every arrival of a new family fresh off a ship from Europe was written into the congregation diary, in German, in longhand, decade after decade without a gap, alongside notes on the weather, the harvest, and whichever hymn had been chosen for that evening's Singstunde, a level of daily detail that later generations of family historians would come to treat as an almost unreasonable stroke of luck. 26 years later, the church moved south. In 1753, the Moravians purchased nearly 100,000 acres in the North Carolina Piedmont, a tract they named Wachovia after one of Zinzendorf's family estates back in Austria, and began building a string of towns there as well. Bethabara came first, intended only as a temporary settlement while the land was cleared, its earliest residents living under one shared roof through a brutal first winter, with wolves reportedly circling close enough to the cabin walls that the men took turns keeping watch through the night. Bethania followed in 1759, built partly to house German-speaking families who had arrived seeking land but were not yet full church members, a kind of outer ring around the strict congregation towns that still ended up absorbed into the same web of intermarriage within a generation or two. Salem, meant to be the permanent central town, was laid out in 1766 and grew into what is now the historic core of Winston-Salem, complete with its own bakery, tavern, tannery, and a cemetery the congregation called God's Acre, where graves were arranged in rows by choir rather than by family, flat identical stones marking single brothers, single sisters, married men, and married women in separate sections, regardless of how wealthy or humble the family behind each name had been. Every one of these towns, north and south, operated under that same choir system, organizing the congregation not by household but by age, sex, and marital status, with even courtship handled through a formal process that sometimes ran through the elders rather than through the couple themselves. It sounds unusual today, but it produced one effect that matters enormously to anyone doing family research now. It kept the congregation physically close and socially closed, generation after generation, and marriages tended to happen inside that same circle of families who had crossed the Atlantic together or arrived within a few years of each other, often the children of one ship's passenger list marrying the grandchildren of another. That closed circle is exactly what population geneticists find interesting, and not only in this one case. Isolated founding populations, whether they are religious refugees in Pennsylvania, Anabaptist communities in Ohio, or islanders off the coast of Newfoundland, tend to produce what researchers call a founder effect, a narrowing of the gene pool down to whatever variation the original small group happened to carry with them across the ocean. The math behind it is simple, even if the results feel strange from the outside. A handful of founding families, say 200 or 300 people total across both the Pennsylvania and North Carolina congregations, only carried a fraction of the genetic variation present across the wider European population they had left behind, and every generation that continued marrying inside that same closed circle locked that narrower slice of variation in a little tighter. Marry inside that pool for 5 or 6 generations, and specific genetic markers, along with specific surnames, start showing up in a wildly disproportionate share of the local population centuries later, long after the descendants themselves have scattered into ordinary American life and lost track of why their last name feels so concentrated in one particular valley. It is why a genealogist working the Yadkin Valley or the Lehigh Valley today can often guess, from a last name alone, that a family's roots trace back to one of these congregation towns, sometimes to one specific ship crossing in the 1740s, decades before the country that would eventually surround these towns even existed, and long before anyone involved could have imagined descendants spitting into a tube 2.5 centuries later to confirm it. None of this required anything unusual to happen. It only required a few hundred people to keep marrying inside the same circle for long enough that the math quietly did the rest. So here are 10 surnames pulled straight from those old congregation diaries and store ledgers, counting down from the 10th to the very first name written into the Bethlehem register. Number 10 is Rauch. Christian Henry Rauch arrived in Pennsylvania in 1740 and became the first Moravian missionary sent out from the Bethlehem community, walking north into the Hudson Valley to live among the Mohican people at a settlement called Checomeco, learning their language well enough to preach and to translate hymns before colonial authorities eventually forced the mission to relocate under pressure from suspicious neighboring settlers. Rauch's own relatives stayed rooted in the Lehigh Valley congregation towns for the rest of the century, and the name recurs again and again in the Bethlehem and Nazareth church registers through the 1700s, tied to weavers, tanners, and at least 2 generations of teachers in the congregation school, an institution that drew boarding students from as far away as the West Indies because of its reputation for discipline and languages. Descendants scattered out of eastern Pennsylvania in the 1800s once the closed congregation system loosened, and members were finally permitted to live and marry outside the church towns without special permission from the elders, carrying the Rauch name into Ohio, Indiana, and eventually much further west along the same migration routes that carried thousands of other Pennsylvania Dutch families. Some of those descendants eventually left the church entirely once they settled further west, but the surname itself kept turning up in Moravian-adjacent communities for another 2 generations, a small trail of baptismal records connecting Ohio farmhouses back to a single Lehigh Valley household. If your family has old Pennsylvania Dutch country roots and a Rauch anywhere in the tree, there is a real chance the line runs straight back to a missionary who never set out to found anything, only to walk into the woods with a hymnal and preach. Number 9 is Horsfield. Timothy Horsfield was not born into the church at all. He was an English immigrant and a tanner by trade who joined the Moravian congregation as an adult after settling near Bethlehem, and he became one of the town's most important early citizens, eventually serving as a justice of the peace and helping manage relations between the Moravian settlements and the colonial government during a period when tensions with neighboring colonists ran dangerously high, particularly during the French and Indian War, when Bethlehem's neutrality and its close ties to native communities made it an object of suspicion for some of its own English-speaking neighbors. His descendants stayed embedded in the Bethlehem congregation for generations, and the Horsfield name shows up in property records and tannery accounts across Northampton County well into the 19th century, long after tanning itself had faded as a local trade. What makes Horsfield an interesting entry in this countdown is that it proves the Moravian gene pool was never entirely closed from the outside. Outsiders did marry in on occasion, and once they did, their descendants were absorbed just as completely into the same tight web of congregation families as anyone whose ancestors had crossed directly from Herrnhut, their children baptized in the same registers and buried under the same flat stones in God's acre as families who had never spoken a word of English at home. Later Horsfield descendants moved into shopkeeping and civic office in and around Bethlehem, and the family name continued showing up in local newspapers and county records well past the point when the original congregation towns had opened themselves fully to the outside world. Number 8 is Boehler. Peter Boehler was among the most influential Moravian leaders to ever set foot in Pennsylvania, a minister whose preaching in London had a direct hand in the religious conversion of a young Anglican clergyman named John Wesley, who later went on to found Methodism, a connection that still surprises people who assume the 2 denominations developed in complete isolation from one another. Boehler later crossed to America and helped organize congregation life in both Bethlehem and Nazareth, overseeing the construction of the very first communal buildings before returning to Europe for church leadership duties, and families carrying his name remained fixtures of the Pennsylvania Moravian community for decades afterward. Church registers from Nazareth list Boehler households tied to farming and to the congregation's boarding schools, which drew Moravian and non-Moravian children alike from across the colonies, and later the young republic, some sent from as far as the southern states specifically for a Moravian education. A surname connected this directly to one of the founding sparks of an entirely separate American denomination is rare, and it means a family researching a Boehler line in Pennsylvania might find their search branching into Methodist history just as easily as Moravian history, two entirely different congregational worlds tied together by one traveling minister's conversation on a London street. Number 7 is Bagge. Traugott Bagge ran the Salem Community Store starting in the 1770s, and in doing so became one of the most meticulous record keepers in the entire history of Wachovia, a man whose personal correspondence and account books survive in far greater detail than almost anything else from backcountry North Carolina in that period. His store ledgers track trade with Cherokee hunters, backcountry farmers, and travelers passing through on the wagon roads connecting the coast to the mountains, recording everything from bolts of cloth to gunpowder to the price of a single nail, and those ledgers survive today as one of the richest sources historians have for understanding everyday economic life in the North Carolina Piedmont before the American Revolution. The Bagge name stayed tied to Salem commerce for generations after Traugott's death, and descendants remained active in the town's merchant class well into the 1800s, some later moving into banking as Salem itself grew into a regional commercial center. Anyone with Bagge ancestors in the Piedmont Triad region of North Carolina is very likely tracing a line straight back to the man who kept Salem's books, ledger after ledger, in handwriting so consistent that archivists can still date undated correspondence just from the shape of his letters. Number 6 is Steiner. Abraham Steiner was a Moravian missionary who left the relative safety of Salem to help run Spring Place, a mission the church established among the Cherokee Nation in what is now northern Georgia, teaching literacy and trades alongside religious instruction for more than 2 decades, and keeping his own detailed diary of the mission's daily life, which historians still consult as one of the fuller first-hand records of Cherokee society before forced removal. His extended family remained deeply woven into the Salem and Bethabara congregations even while he was away on mission work for years at a stretch, and Steiner descendants appear repeatedly in North Carolina Moravian church records straight through the 19th century, some staying in ministry and others moving into farming and trade around the growing town, their names threading through baptismal and burial registers on both sides of the mission's long distance, Georgia and North Carolina bound together by one family's choice to serve far from home. The Spring Place mission itself became one of the most thoroughly documented points of contact between a European-American religious community and a native nation in the early Republic, and the Steiner name sits at the center of that record, a reminder that these quiet Piedmont towns had connections stretching far beyond their own fences, all the way into a mission house several hundred miles south, where a Wachovia surname was being written into an entirely different chapter of American history. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Number 5 is Blum. John Christian Blum began publishing an agricultural almanac out of Salem in 1828, filled with planting schedules, weather predictions, phases of the moon, and practical advice for Piedmont farmers, printed cheaply enough that even the poorest households in the surrounding countryside could afford a copy each year. And the publication became such a fixture of regional life that it kept running under the Blum name for more than a century after his death, long past the point when most Americans had stopped consulting printed almanacs for anything at all. Generations of Blum descendants stayed in the printing and publishing trade in and around Salem, running one of the earliest and longest continuously operating print shops in the southern United States, and the almanac itself became something close to a shared cultural touchstone across the entire Yadkin Valley, sitting in farmhouse kitchens beside the family Bible for well over 100 years. The almanac survived wars, epidemics, and the collapse of dozens of similar publications elsewhere in the country, in part because Piedmont farm families kept buying it out of pure habit long after newspapers and radio forecasts had made most of its actual predictions unnecessary. Later generations of the Blum family diversified out of almanac printing into general job printing, handling everything from church bulletins to legal notices for surrounding counties, keeping the family name attached to the printed page in the region for well over a century. Copies of the original 19th century almanacs still surface occasionally in estate sales and local historical society collections across the Piedmont, brittle little pamphlets that once told entire farming communities when to expect the first frost of the season. If an older relative from North Carolina ever mentioned consulting Blum's almanac before planting a garden or predicting the weather for a harvest, there is a real chance that habit traces back through an unbroken thread to a Moravian printer's shop in the 1820s. One small business that outlasted nearly everything else built around it. Number 4 is Transou. The name began as a French Huguenot surname before the family that carried it was absorbed into the Moravian congregation at Bethlehem, one of several instances where refugees from a different persecuted Protestant tradition folded themselves into the Wachovia community rather than starting over entirely on their own in an unfamiliar colony. Transou households appear in the Bethlehem congregation registers by the late 1700s, intermarried with the same core group of German-speaking families that founded the town, their French surnames surviving intact even as every other trace of their Huguenot origins quietly folded into the surrounding German-speaking culture within 2 generations. And the surname has remained concentrated in the surrounding Forsyth and Davie County area of North Carolina ever since. Rare almost everywhere else in the country outside of families that specifically trace back to this one Piedmont pocket. A surname this geographically concentrated is exactly the kind of signature a founder effect leaves behind, a name that essentially does not exist outside a 50-mile radius unless a family branch specifically moved away for work or marriage sometime in the last century. Local land deeds and tax lists from Bethlehem and its surrounding districts show Transou households holding onto the same farm parcels across multiple generations. Neighbors to the same Butner and Hauser families their ancestors had married into 100 years earlier. A pattern repeated so often in these records that it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like the ordinary rhythm of a closed farming community that simply never had a reason to scatter. Modern census records for the same corner of North Carolina still turn up more Transou households than a person would find across several entire neighboring states combined, a small demographic echo of one French family's decision 300 years ago to seek shelter inside a German-speaking religious community rather than push further into the backcountry on their own. Number 3 is Butner. The Butner family settled in and around Bethlehem in the decades following the town's founding, farming land along the edges of the original Wachovia tract for generation after generation without much fanfare, showing up in tax lists and militia rolls far more often than in any story anyone thought worth telling at the time, and the name eventually attached itself permanently to the map when a 20th century government land purchase in the same area created a new town that was simply named Butner after the family whose farmland it had once been. It is an unusual kind of legacy, a Moravian-era surname reaching nearly 2 centuries forward to name an entirely new North Carolina town, one most residents today have no idea was named for an 18th century congregation family, rather than anything more official sounding like a founding governor or a war hero. Descendants of the original Butner households remain scattered through the Piedmont, some still farming land not far from where the family first settled, and finding the name in an old family Bible from that region is a strong signal of Wachovia roots. The town of Butner itself grew into a small planned community built around a wartime manufacturing plant and later a set of state institutions, a strange modern echo of the original Moravian towns that once dotted the same tract. Planned settlements built for a specific purpose on land that had already been carefully organized once before, 2 centuries apart, by 2 completely unrelated sets of planners who never knew about each other. Longtime residents of the modern town sometimes learn the origin of its own name only by accident, usually from a visiting historian or a genealogist working a family line back through the exact fields the community now sits on, surprised to discover that the plain, unassuming name on their town's welcome sign carries a direct line back to a Wachovia farmhouse 200 years older than anything else in town. Number 2 is Vogler. The Vogler family produced some of the finest clockmakers, gunsmiths, and silversmiths in the entire history of Salem, and their preserved home on Salem's Main Street stands today as one of the most visited buildings in Old Salem, the restored historic district that now draws visitors from across the country curious about how a religious refugee community once lived. John Vogler, born in 1783, built a reputation as a master craftsman whose clocks and silverwork are still displayed in museum collections today, each piece stamped or engraved with enough of a personal mark that collectors and historians can trace individual items back to his workshop with real confidence. And his descendants carried the trade forward through multiple generations, adapting from clockmaking into jewelry and metalwork as the town's economy shifted through the 19th century away from a purely communal model toward ordinary private enterprise. The Vogler name remains common enough in the Winston-Salem area that longtime residents rarely think twice about it, unaware that it traces back to one specific immigrant craftsman's workshop rather than simply being an ordinary German surname that happened to land in North Carolina by chance. Visitors touring the restored Vogler house today can still see the tools of the trade laid out roughly as they would have been in the early 1800s, and museum staff who research the family's account books continue to turn up new details about which pieces of surviving Salem silver and which working clocks in area homes actually came out of that one workshop rather than being later imports from Philadelphia or Charleston. Several branches of the family stayed in the trades their ancestor had practiced well into the 20th century, watch repair shops and jewelry counters carrying a name that had been attached to fine metalwork in the same small stretch of North Carolina for well over 100 years by the time anyone thought to write the story down for tourists. And number one, the surname recorded earliest and most often across the entire span of Moravian settlement in America, is Fries. The Fries family arrived among Salem's original founding households in the 1760s and never left the town's center of gravity for the next 2 centuries, appearing in nearly every decade of congregation records from farming leases to church council minutes. Francis Fries, born in 1812, built textile mills along the creek running through Salem that grew into one of the largest manufacturing operations in the entire state, employing workers drawn from well beyond the original congregation and pulling Salem permanently out of the closed communal economy the town had run on for its first 100 years, transforming a religious farming community into an industrial town almost overnight, and giving the eventual merged city of Winston-Salem much of its economic backbone for the century that followed. A later member of the same family, Adelaide Fries, became the church's own archivist and historian, spending decades transcribing and publishing the original German congregation diaries into English as a massive multi-volume set of records that remains the single most important printed source for anyone researching Wachovia ancestry today, a project so thorough that professional genealogists still cite her volumes by name more than 100 years later. It is a strange kind of symmetry. A family that helped build the region's mills also became the family responsible for preserving the very documents that let their neighbors trace their own roots back to the same founding generation. Other Fries descendants moved into banking, education, and civic leadership as Winston-Salem grew through the 20th century, and the name still appears on buildings, streets, and institutions across the city today. A surname so woven into the local landscape that most residents encounter it dozens of times before ever learning it belonged to one of the original refugee families who arrived with almost nothing 2.5 centuries earlier. Genealogists tracing a Fries line out of the North Carolina Piedmont today are, in a real sense, using tools that a member of their own family tree spent much of her life quietly building for exactly that purpose. A research project so large it eventually filled a shelf of bound volumes still consulted in archives and libraries across the state. 10 names, 3 states' worth of descendants, and one closed religious community that never meant to leave a genetic fingerprint on an entire region of the country, only to keep its own records so carefully that the fingerprint became impossible to miss once anyone bothered to look for it. Somewhere between a Pennsylvania forest in 1741 and a North Carolina creek bank in 1766, a small group of refugees built towns meant to hold a faith together and ended up holding a set of family lines together instead, tightly enough that pieces of them are still findable in ordinary American families 2.5 centuries later, long after most of the descendants stopped speaking German or attending a Moravian church at all. If one of these 10 names turned up somewhere in your own family tree tonight, you are not imagining the coincidence. You are looking at exactly what a founder effect is supposed to do, patiently, quietly, for 250 years, tucked inside congregation diaries and store ledgers and almanacs, until someone finally goes looking. What makes these particular towns so useful for that kind of search is the sheer stubbornness of the record-keeping itself. Most colonial American communities left scattered church books, incomplete tax rolls, and family Bibles that may or may not have survived a house fire somewhere along the way. The Moravian towns left something closer to a continuous paper trail, decade folded into decade, name folded into name, precisely because a closed community that tracked every birth, marriage, and burial for its own internal purposes ended up building, almost by accident, one of the most complete genealogical archives in early America. A refugee community trying only to hold its own faith together across an ocean left behind a map that their descendants, centuries later and scattered across the entire country, can still use to find their way back to a single Pennsylvania forest or a single North Carolina creek bank. None of the original settlers who wrote their names into those first congregation diaries could have pictured a great-great-great-grandchild scrolling through a digitized church register on a phone screen, but that is exactly the inheritance they left behind, more durable in its own quiet way than any of the buildings still standing in Old Salem or Old Bethlehem. A closed circle of a few hundred refugees turned out to be large enough, after 250 years of careful record-keeping and quiet intermarriage, to leave a mark on an entire country that never noticed it was carrying one, hidden in plain sight inside ordinary last names on ordinary mailboxes, from the Lehigh Valley down to the Yadkin Valley. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.